All right, so we are up to now session 6, ethics and natural law. But I'm actually going to begin with a very brief whirlwind crash course in philosophical psychology. And this is just something we're going to need to get at some of the principles we're going to look at in this session. So some of this will be review, some of it is going to be new as well. So and if you don't catch all of this, that's all right. The main thing is to somewhat follow the argument and get a bit familiar with some of the terms. But don't be too worried if you can't follow all of it. So just follow this through for a minute. Anything that exists is either a substance, that is an independent thing. You could think a substance would be a man or a tree, okay, an independent thing in nature, or an accident. That might be like a property of a thing, okay? Um, so, being bald is accidental to me, or having green leaves is an accident to a tree. It's possible for a tree to be a tree and not have green leaves, even if it normally gets them at some time of the year. Okay. Now, substance is either matter, which is potency. So here you can think of whatever. I think the best examples are in crafts. So matter, like like wood, a pile of wood is in potency to a form that it can take on. So a pile of wood can become a table, but with respect to the table, the wood is matter. It has to have a form come to it, and that is its actuality as a table. So the wood as wood is in potency to the form that can come to it. Okay, so substance is either matter, form, or a composite. All right, so when they come together, you have an actual thing that is that's a composite of matter and form. Actuality, a couple of distinctions here. First, actuality, a good analogy here is knowledge that is possessed, okay, something that I know. Second, actuality, a good analogy here is knowledge that I possess that I come back and consider. All right, so if I'm calling something to mind. So first actuality and second actuality, we can really just get at them by analogies. Again, don't worry too much about trying to understand them completely. Now, switching gears a little bit here, a body, okay, a material body is either natural or artificial. If it's natural, both its matter and its form are substantial. Okay, any natural thing, a tree, a man. Okay, if it's artificial, the matter is substantial, natural, but the form is accidental, like the wooden table that I mentioned before. Okay, that's artificial. It's made of substance, that's the wood, but its form, its arrangement as a table is accidental. All right, if you take it apart, the wood is still wood. And then a body can be either non-living or living. So now let's come back with some of these terms with respect to the human person. Okay, a human person, of course, is living. A human person is natural, right? You can't, the fact that we're human is not accidental to us. You can't take away our human form and still have the same underlying stuff. All right, we're living, we're natural, we are composite of matter and form. Okay, and we are a substance. Now, the first actuality, which again is analogous to knowledge that is just is knowledge that is there before it's sort of activated. The first actuality is the soul itself. The second actuality is acts of the soul. Okay, so the the first actuality is the soul. The second actuality is acts of the soul. So these are just some terms that are going to come up and that are in scholastic philosophy here. Okay, if we're talking about quote unquote parts of the soul, now we're not talking about quantitative parts. The parts of a soul can't be split or divided down the middle in the way the parts of the body can, but it's a power to perform some activity. Okay, a power to perform some activity. All right, so let's slip past this and go on to the next slide. All right, 3 levels of souls. This comes from Aristotle. At the lowest level, a soul is that first actuality, remember? First actuality. And as any living thing, according to Aristotle, has a soul. So this is a different notion of soul, a broader notion of soul than we have now. We tend to just apply soul to humans, but Aristotle distinguishes 3 kind of levels or kinds of souls, and the scholastic philosophers receive this as well. So at the lowest level, there's vegetative or nutritive. This is just the ability to nourish and reproduce itself, okay? So plants have this, the vegetative soul. Then there's a sensitive soul, which has all the powers of the vegetative soul, but also powers flowing from bodily organs in sensation, okay? But those powers transcend the elements making them up. In other words, whatever elements you would break down the body into, sensation transcends those elements, okay? So animals have a sensitive soul, which again includes the powers of the vegetative. That's not to say that animals have 2 souls. It's not that they have a vegetative and a sensitive soul. It's that they have a sensitive soul, which includes all of the powers that are in the vegetative. Okay, then the highest level, the rational or intellective soul, has all the powers of these ones above, plus powers that transcend the body itself. In other words, immaterial powers. Okay, and of course, this is human persons. All right, so the point here is that we have powers in our soul that are derived from the fact that are derived from the vegetative aspect, from the sensitive aspect, and from the rational aspect. Okay, this is important in ethics in determining what we're really for, what we're really about. Okay, finally, I know this looks a little crazy here, but let's now divide up some of these powers. Okay, the human powers, we have rational by nature and non-rational by nature. Okay, the rational power by nature is just reason itself. This is distinct to the human person. Non-rational, there's a power of the soul that is rational by extension. This is the will, and we'll get to how that works with the intellect and reason. And then down here, we have things that are in common with other beings, with other living things. Okay, of course, we have the vegetating powers, digesting, growing, reproduction. We have what are called the appetites. All right, that's what this middle is. The appetites, these are divided into 2 kinds, concupiscible and irascible. Think of concupiscible as I want, or is if you want something that's pleasurable, okay? Irascible is kind of your get up and go. This is where anger comes from, okay? So then we have the type of sense knowledge, okay? And we have the external kind, which is the 5 senses, and then internal, which is the imagination, which is derived from the 5 senses. All right, I know this is, I just needed to go through these slides to get you familiar with some terminology. Before I go on to the material proper for today, are there any questions on that?
I'll start one.
Mm-hmm.
Is the line rational by extension coming from non-rational?
Um, it is the way the will is made rational is by interaction with the intellect. That will be made a little bit clearer as we go through and see the process of a human action. Okay, let's look at today's material. 3 main sections. We're going to look at ethics, natural law, and then some contemporary ethical theories. Jumping into ethics. Ethics as a science is the science that considers man acting for an end voluntarily. So ethics ends in action. We've mostly before been looking at speculative sciences, which are science for their own sake. Ethics is different. It's in the realm of practical knowledge. Okay, a couple things also that are important here. Note that I can choose what I do. In other words, I can eat an ice cream cone, but I cannot choose what I get. I can't choose pleasure. Pleasure is something that comes with the end being achieved. All right, so I might seek pleasure, I might want pleasure, but I can't choose pleasure. Otherwise, we would just choose to be pleased all the time. If I eat an ice cream cone, in order to gain pleasure, I might actually get a brain freeze. Okay, so there's an example of how I can't choose pleasure. Now I only choose what seems to be good. So good, Aristotle says, is that for the sake of which everything else is to be done. So we all have this innate notion towards the good. Just like with knowledge, we all seek the truth. We all have an innate desire for the truth. Even if we end up believing things that are wrong, we have that desire for the truth. The reason we believe something that's wrong is because we believe it's true. So even when we believe something that's wrong, it's done under the aspect of truth. In the same way, when we choose something that's evil, it's under the aspect of the good. It's because we think it's good. And we'll see how that works in a little bit more detail. So a few more distinctions here. Pure ends are things that are willed for their own sake. Ends and means, something that's an ends and a means, is something that it is willed for its own sake and for the sake of something else. Things that are willed just for the sake of something else are pure means. Aristotle argues that perfect happiness is the only thing that everyone seeks for its own sake, that everything else is sought for the sake of happiness, or it might be for something else too, but happiness is involved in that somehow. So that, in other words, he'll say there is no other pure ends than perfect happiness. And then if the good is that for the sake of which everything else is done, as we noted up here, and happiness has this attribute to the highest degree, then happiness, he says, must be the ultimate human good. So let's look at that in a little bit more detail. So let's take our first reading on the ultimate human good from St. Thomas. Okay, so according to Aquinas, every agent acts for the sake of a good. So how do you think this can happen, even with evil acts? How can that be? Any ideas there?
I think you said it.
Yeah.
You're believing something is good even though it's not good.
So where does the, if we all have an innate notion of good, somehow where does the error come?
Well, your innate notion is not necessarily perfect, not necessarily correct as you understand it. You can substitute something that's a lesser good for an ultimate good. You can substitute something that looks like a good for a good. You can make mistakes. That's even assuming you consciously are looking for the good. I mean, people think that that destruction and social upheaval is good.
Right.
Nietzsche flips everything and says the opposite of what you think is good, Catholic, is good. You're really doing wrong.
So how about this? What's the relationship between the intellect and the will that St. Thomas outlines here?
I would think that the intellect thinks about what is good, and once it arrives at what it thinks is the good, then the will starts to pursue it.
All right, good. So in other words, the will needs to receive something from the intellect, right?
Right.
So as he says in chapter 25, section 10, this is halfway down the right side. So let's see, the intellect is found to be the superior mover, for the intellect moves the appetite by presenting it with its object. Now, by appetite, he's talking about an aspect of the will, right? The desire for the good. That's what an appetite is. So what does that indicate about what the relationship might be between truth and ethics? How does that interaction of the intellect and will, what does that say about the relationship between the two, or the role of truth in ethics?
Well, are you saying, again, the intellect is pursuing what it believes to be true, and once it finds the truth or perceives the truth, then the will goes about the means to procure it? Is that what you're moving towards? Okay.
Yeah. So in other words, as the implication here, what he's talking about in this paragraph about what the main mover is here, being the intellect, means that if we're going to act rightly, it depends on the truth, right?
I want to apologize for this question, but which handout are you referring to? What are you referring to when you talk? Is it one of the ones we used last week?
I'm sorry? Which
handout are you talking about when you're referring to the Summa Contra Gentilis passage?
In the Seminar 6 readings.
Okay.
So does the intellect provide the moral rationale for the will to act? Is that what you're saying?
Well, what do you think?
Well, I think it does. And I mean, the rationale can be good or bad,
Yeah.
And it gives the basis for the will to act. Now, the will can follow the intellect or not follow the intellect too. So you have various permutations and combinations of things. The intellect there's a good. So the intellect is steering you toward the good, and your will can move the other way, or the intellect is, or it could move either way, and vice versa. The intellect could be steering one toward something that's not good by an improperly formed conscience, intellect.
Yeah, so we're going to break this down more. I'm being a bit intentionally vague here, but I think one important thing to keep in mind is the object of the intellect is the true. The object of the intellect is truth.
Right.
The object of the will is good. So we're tending, it's just important to keep that distinction in mind all through this. I know I had some other questions on here about what man's ultimate happiness consists in. So Thomas argues here that his ultimate happiness consists in understanding of God, contemplation of God. I'm going to skip over that for now, just for the sake of time, and get back to our presentation, unless anybody has a extremely pressing question or comment on that. All right, let's back up here. Now let's look a little bit more into relationship between intellect and will, knowing and willing. I'm going to jump down to, okay, right here. Intellect and will, again, are powers of the soul, not parts in the sense of being able to divide something in half, all right? Just want to make sure we're clear about this. The soul is one thing. The soul is one thing with multiple powers. The intellect and will are powers of the rational soul. The intellect operates as a formal cause for choosing. So this is what we're talking about, where the intellect proposes something to the will. The will is an efficient cause for reasoning. Now, how does that work? Let's zoom into this chart here. Put in my marks. So here's a breakdown of the process of a human act. Down this column on the left, we have acts of the intellect. Down this side on the right, we have the will. Let's follow this now. So the intellect apprehends an end as good and proposes it to the will. The will wills the end. Okay, then so the will has an inclination towards the end. Then there is judgment about the end. In other words, this end is good or evil. All right. Then the will forms an intentionality, to pursue or not to pursue. Then if we're pursuing that end, there is deliberation about the means in the intellect. All right. This is consideration of different things to achieve that end. Again, if my end is the pleasure the sense pleasure gotten in eating something, then my means, my intellect, after deliberating, might propose an ice cream cone as a great means to get to that end. Okay, the will consents. Okay, then this is then there's the practical judgment of the choice to be made. Now, what does that mean? In order to get to get this whole process through, it has to start with an immediate thing before me. All right. If I say I'm going to get an ice cream cone, and that's the means. Well, there's a lot of practical things I have to go through even in order to do that. I might even do it thoughtlessly, but there is practical judgment involved there. All right, and then there is choice of that means. All right, of going downstairs, opening up the freezer, and getting ice cream out of it. Okay, so there's choice of that means, and then in the intellect, command to execute the choice. In the will, the use of the powers. This is the powers of the soul that we're looking at before, which extends to bodily powers. Use of powers to execute that choice. Then, once the process is finished, then there's judgment about the end as attained. All right. So if I get the pleasure, I have to know that I've gotten the end that I desired, right? And there is enjoyment. All right. So enjoyment of that. So we have this process that goes back and forth, even with a simple act as going to get an ice cream cone. As for the precise operation of each of these, it's going to take us a bit beyond the scope of what we have time for right now. But the most important thing is here, that it starts in the intellect with an apprehension of an end as good. And that is what sets the will in motion. Now, in terms of error, we can see many opportunities for error along the way here, right? We can apprehend an end, and then we might make a wrong judgment. We might judge something to be good that is in fact evil. All right. Or we might judge something appropriately, but then make errors in our deliberation about the means. Propose something as a means. The intellect might propose something as a means that is not an appropriate means. Let's see. Or we might even get all the way down to here correctly, and then for one reason or another, maybe because of fear or whatever, or laziness, we might fail here in the execution. So there are lots of opportunities all along the way where we can go wrong between the intellect and the will in making an action good, in choosing the right end and choosing the right means to getting there. Let's talk about a couple of errors here. A couple other errors. So errors regarding the ultimate good. We were talking last time about the ultimate good, especially with, we were talking about that quote from St. Anselm, right? I do not seek to understand that I may believe, but I believe in order to understand. And what he's talking about here, he's believing in order to understand God, right? Because as we're talking about, St. Thomas shows that the understanding of God, that the knowledge of God is the ultimate end and happiness for man. So from that, it's an error to try to rest in faith, to think that faith is ultimate. Faith is not ultimate. Faith goes somewhere. Faith seeks satisfaction in knowledge. Now, not knowledge of finite things, but knowledge in the infinite. And the important thing here is we can't just, again, sign our name on the bottom of a list of beliefs and say that we've satisfied our obligation. Trying to rest Another place trying to rest where rest is impossible, in scientific knowledge, okay, or demonstrative knowledge. Any knowledge that is that is of that limited kind. It doesn't matter how much of that we have. That is not ultimate happiness. It is a kind of happiness, a lesser form of happiness, a share in happiness, but not ultimate happiness. Okay, or failing to identify the ultimate good. If we identify the ultimate good as pleasure or power or world peace or personal liberty, or another one is trying to instantiate transcendent happiness on earth, attempting to establish a utopia, believing that that's possible and trying to bring that about.
Question.
Yes.
If trying to instantiate a utopia on earth is wrong, how would you convince somebody, that we're not to be trying to improve on the human condition? Where do you draw the line between, yeah, we're trying, I want to feed the poor, I want to help people, stuff like that. On the other hand, I am not trying to increase total amount of happiness on earth.
I think that we are trying to increase the total amount of happiness on earth, but that is that's part of that's part of getting to ultimate happiness. So it's not complete utter misery until we suddenly get ultimate happiness. What we're going to get to next, I think that's actually a great transition into virtue. So Aristotle, in when he's considering virtue, he considers the proper operation of a thing. All right, and when we were looking at the operation or the makeup of a human person, what set a human person apart was the rationality. So, and Aristotle thinks, well, what makes a good hammer? What makes a good hammer? A good hammer has certain characteristics, right? A bad hammer might be a hammer that is, made of cotton. That would be a bad hammer. Or so basically it's related to the nature, the proper nature of a thing. He thinks that the good for something is going to be related to its proper operation. So for a human being, the proper operation for a human is rationality. So virtue is actually that it's an approach to ultimate happiness that does not itself consist of ultimate happiness, but it's an imperfect participation in it. It's on the way. So for something to operate properly, whether it's a hammer or a tree or a person, then it has to have certain characteristics. A tree that is planted in between cracks in the sidewalk is not going to be able to fulfill its potential, its fullness, its flourishing. So since reason is what sets man apart, Aristotle says the proper operation of reason through the whole human person is what brings us to happiness. Now, the difference between Aristotle and the Christian view is that for Aristotle, perfect happiness is not possible. The best we can do is have a good full life and have all of the virtues to the greatest degree possible. For the Christian view, perfect happiness is possible, but not in this life. As long as we have a body, there's an element of potentiality in us. And the perfect activity is going to be when we are viewing God face to face. That was, I probably went off on a tangent beyond what you were.
Well, let me stop there. As long as we have a body, we have potentiality. Is that true after death when you've been raised from the dead and in heaven?
So we have, we can't really say anything about the resurrected body.
Well, does that potentiality is the question? I didn't think so.
It's part of it. I mean, as long as we are made of, as long as we are a body, soul, a matter form composite in the way we are now, any potentiality is a limitation. Our perfect happiness will be perfect actuality. It'll be at least according to our mode, which is different for every person, St. Thomas argues. So each of us has a kind and a particular limit to happiness based on our own abilities and God-given traits. But full happiness will be the fullest of that, which cannot be achieved in the body. Let's take a look at this excerpt from the Summa. This one's a little bit tricky. So our second reading, whether human virtue is an operative habit, from the Summa. First, what do you think about Aristotle's definition of virtue here? Virtue of a thing is that which makes its work good. Or maybe one of these other questions about the distinction between the two kinds of power, or virtue being more like something static or more like something dynamic.
Are you saying that virtue is the strengthening of a person's will and intellect that helps him pursue the good? Is that how you're defining virtue? Like, I might have a desire to be patient and I practice exercises in pursuing patience and acquiring is virtue the means by which I acquire patience, or is virtue the patience itself?
Or is it both?
Okay.
Yeah, I think that's exactly the question. Is virtue? So I think what stuck out to me with what you were saying was when you talked about like a strengthening, because that's exactly where the word virtue comes from. It comes from a word that means the strength, the proper strength of that sort of thing.
Go ahead.
So then, is virtue more like something that is, can you sit around and have a virtue?
It's dynamic. It's potential. Since Marty's initial question was about, or I keep on thinking of people that want to go off and form a Catholic ghetto, where they have everything they need right there to get to heaven, and it becomes a static environment where, to me, virtue is potentiality. So we're always trying to strive for a higher level. It's not something that's static.
Yeah, I think you're definitely right. That's what he's getting. That's definitely one of the things he's getting at here. That it's operative. That virtue must be something that is that we're doing. That's the evidence. The evidence of the virtue, the evidence of the habit, is the activity of that habit. Oh, Kirk, your sound's not on.
Virtue is a means to an end, essentially, right?
It is, yeah.
Whatever that end is, there's a particular virtue that will get you there.
Right, but then in order to acquire the virtue, how do you acquire the virtue? If virtue is the means,
You have to practice the virtue to increase the effectiveness. If I can't think of a better word. If I'm trying to be patient, then I have to exercise patience in order to increase the strength and character of my patience. And again, I don't know if it's even a question, but the way to acquire patience is to exercise patience
so
in
acts of patience, yeah.
right, in all kinds of circumstances.
And when it becomes a habit, then you have a virtue.
Right.
Kirk, what were you going to say?
I was just going to say you need to activate the will. I mean, you might have the end in mind as intellectually. You might really want it, but it's not going to come to you. You have to go to it. So you have to.
So you can't.
You have to do something.
You can't suddenly get a habit in a vacuum, right?
I mean, unless you, if the other thing would be unless you already had it, in which case there would be no reason to pursue it. So
I think some of the things coming up here are going to clarify this a little bit more. Now, Aristotle is going to argue that a virtue is a habit inclining us to choose the relative mean between extremes of excess and defect. All right. Again, it's a perfection of powers of the soul. But Aristotle also is going to argue that virtue involves some sort of pleasure in habitually doing the good. And this is what differentiates virtue from what Aristotle will call continence, or the opposite, incontinence. So continence is what we were just talking about. How do you get the virtue? Well, if you're desiring the good and you don't have the habit yet, it's by doing those good acts but with great difficulty. You don't have the habit yet. You don't have that pleasure which comes from that being natural to you. Aristotle, in fact, calls virtue the second nature, right? So then, on the other hand, incontinence is if you're desiring to be good, but failing to do that. So we can imagine a continuum here. Vice over here, and virtue over here. And then we have continence, and we have incontinence here.
We can't see your screen.
Sun is your screen.
Oh, I'm sorry.
That's okay.
Oh, I thought I had it shared the whole time. Thank you. All right, 1 second here. Ah, there we go, much better. So, I'll catch you up here. Mean between extremes involves some pleasure. Here's the image, the diagram I was drawing here, where virtue and vice, we put it on this continuum with continence here, and then incontinence. So everything from here over are where you're desiring the good. incontinence is just you're not able to do it. You just can't bring yourself to choose rightly. But then continence is when you acquire that ability to begin choosing the good, but it's not a habit yet. It's not a second nature yet. And then virtue is when it does become a second nature. All right. So this is not a kind of a hard click in between these where you're suddenly incontinent or suddenly going from incontinence to continence, from continence to virtue. All right. This is a sliding scale because we're looking at actions over time and general trends. Now, vice, on the other hand, vice is basically a firm commitment towards evil acts. Okay, not even desiring to seek the good. So let's look at how these operate, how virtue operates as a mean between excess and defect. A couple examples here. So in the sphere of facing danger, the virtue is courage, and that's going to be the mean between rashness, that's the excess, running into danger, versus cowardice, that's going to be the deficiency. All right, or let's pick another one. Liberality, the virtue of liberality in terms of money or just things that we have. The deficiency is going to be stinginess. The excess is going to be being wasteful. So this is how Aristotle sees virtue as being a mean between extremes. Now, the purpose of this diagram down here is to show that it's not the case, as some people have occasionally half-jokingly said, that, well, virtue should be practiced moderately, that we should only have a moderate amount of virtue. No, virtue itself is the mean, and we should practice that mean to the extreme, and that is the proper operation. Any questions on this slide before we go on? And we're going to go on talking about particular virtues.
I've run across this before about a virtue being a mean between two extremes, but it kind of interests me how Aristotle had come to this. Wow, how he drew this conclusion. I mean, I can see that he's right, because if you're going towards a particular end, all right, you could either do it very aggressively or very laxly. I guess that's a word. But neither would be effective. There seems to be a right level of energy, I guess, that needs to be expended.
Yeah.
In order to achieve the end.
Mm-hmm.
So I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, I think
I'm just kind of wondering what the background of how he actually came up with this.
To be frank, I don't have on hand the argument sufficient to recapitulate it here, but I think that what he is looking at is that our human actions that are motivated in a particular sphere that's related to some aspect of our person, whether it's a certain power we have, such as sense pleasure, or or something that we have, such as money or wealth, and then the just basically noticing that according to these spheres, there are sometimes that we seem to act and it just doesn't go right. And then we reflect on that and say, Well, maybe I should have spoken up there. I was being overly cautious, or to the extent of being cowardly. And then that kind of goes back into the next time to our deliberation of when and how to go about an action. So it's this process over time of kind of refining how we respond to different kinds of situations using the tools that are at hand, the different powers of our soul, and the materials at our disposal.
Okay.
I guess my issue with some of these are they're still very subjective. There's nothing really objective about any of these. Like danger. Like you may encounter danger, but the smart thing may be to run away. I mean, right? I mean, or
Depends.
If you look at money and wealth, it all depends upon where you are in life. Like what may be wastefulness for one person may be the right decision for the other based on their station in life.
That's absolutely right. Yeah, and that's why that's why. So something that might be liberality, the virtue of liberality, for one person might be stinginess for another person. Think of a poor person giving a great deal, a large percentage of their resources to the church, versus somebody who's extremely wealthy giving the same amount, and that would be extreme stinginess for them.
So is that where the virtue of prudence comes in?
Yes. Mm-hmm. Yep. So these are not. You're both right. So none of these are. There's not a particular thing, a particular quantity, or perfect answer that we could put in every case. But there are, even in the case of practicing one virtue, there are other virtues such as prudence that need to come into play. And so we have this process over time of coming to the right habit that is appropriate for us and who we are and where we are in life.
John, it's Catherine. Can I ask a question?
Yes.
On this eudaimonia chart, is that Aristotle's chart or is that Aquinas's chart?
That I don't think came from either one of them. I think that somebody put that together. It's just something I pulled off the internet. A lot of people have put together charts like this. Sometimes some of those are explicitly things that Aristotle mentioned in his Nicomachean Ethics. Others are probably put in there by whoever put it together.
Well, my question is, are the virtues on the left-hand side, are those means to the human being's ultimate end, which is to know God? Are virtues the means to which we come to know God and to become fully human? Or are the virtues an end in themselves, sort of like a stage of development?
Mm-hmm. They're in a way both. They're things that constitute both an end in themselves and a means to that ultimate end. So all of these, because we are persons, the whole person is a composite of many different aspects, many different powers and abilities. And we have come to different ways of talking about all of those different powers and abilities in their operations. The best operation of those is according to reason. And so all of these are about bringing this part of our personality in line with reason. However, you could note that that you can go one at a time with these and find ways that they can be practiced apart from other virtues, against what would be an appropriate life. So, for instance, a lot of people practice temperance in a lot of ways, but they do it in service of the love of their body, or in service of the love of their position, the love of power. Okay, so
Yeah.
so when we take them one at a time, they seem insufficient, but the proper operation of a human being is going to be practice of all the virtues.
Thanks.
But it is not sufficient itself. For Aristotle, that was the best we could get, but we know by revelation that we are made for union with God. So let's talk a little bit more precisely about the breakdown of the virtues. We have, of course, the ancient tradition of the cardinal virtues. We can break them down related to the powers of the soul again. Fortitude and temperance have to do with the passions. Fortitude with the irascible appetite. Remember, that's the get up and go one. Temperance with regard to concupiscible. With respect to the will, justice. With respect to the intellect, prudence. I'm not going to go through all of these in detail. I'm just going to give you an example here, and then we're going to kind of fly through the rest. So fortitude, again, a habit, must be a habit, moderating emotions of fear and boldness. So the defect is cowardice, the excess is going to be rashness. Then there are some other virtues we talk about which are associated with it, which are kind of particular applications of fortitude. Magnanimity, greatness of soul. And this is overcoming obstacles and dangers for the sake of what is right. The different vices that would be opposed to this would be presumption, excessive ambition, or vainglory, pusillanimity, which is literally the opposite. Pusillanimity is smallness of soul. Okay, magnificence, doing great works despite their cost and effort. You can see there's overlap in these, but they're just different ways of talking about applications of the same virtue in different kinds of circumstances. Patience and perseverance. So again, we have temperance, which is respect to the concupiscible appetites. All right. And associated virtues with that, abstinence, sobriety, chastity. So these are all ways of applying temperance to particular kinds of objects: food, drink, sexual pleasure. There's justice. We can talk about general justice. And in this case, justice is kind of an overlord of all the virtues. It's the habit of exercising all the virtues in relation to the common good. Particular justice is when we talk about it in a more precise way of giving another what is due. Okay, then a number of allied virtues with that. Religion is a virtue associated with justice. It's giving to God his due. And it has its own vices of excess and defect in superstition and irreverence, respectively. All right, now on to intellectual virtues. Remember, the object of the will is the good, and the object of the intellect is the true. In speculative, in the speculative intellectual virtues, it's about what is necessary. It is knowledge for its own sake, not for the sake of action. And we talked about this in the very first session, the different distinction between the different sciences. Now, practical is about what can change. This is where the good comes more into play. Prudence as art as the right way of making, prudence as the right way of doing. So prudence is what comes into play about what are the appropriate ways to get to the ends that I'm seeking. But before that, remember, going back to that model of the human action, we have to start with the intellect grasping the true in order to propose to the will a course of action. So I know this is kind of a whirlwind through ethics, but we have a lot to get through now. So let's take a look now at natural law. And we're going to jump into these excerpts from the Catechism and from the Summa. So where does natural law fit in with other kinds of law? Or maybe what makes it natural? Either of these questions.
I think to some extent natural law is the basis on which God created everything. It's the ordering that God has established in the universe.
All right, any others?
Would there be a natural law for humans, a natural law for whales, a natural law for orangutans? Would it be that doing those things that would make you as your nature of that thing to thrive?
All right. Well, I think that would be a great description of virtue. I'm not so sure about natural law. How could we distinguish between laws of nature and natural law?
Well, again, to get back to that, to say natural implies a nature of something.
Mm-hmm.
So if I am a whale, I have a particular essence or nature of a whale. And so it would be good for me to be in the ocean, and it would be not good for me to be in a lake or on dry ground. So is that what you're trying to say, what natural law is? The things that would make that thing thrive? That's my question.
All right. Well, here's maybe a distinction. Does a whale deliberate about whether it's going to be on land or in the sea?
Well, whether it does or not, even if I'm the rational one, I could say it's not natural for a whale to live on land. Therefore, I should not do that because it's against the natural law for that whale to be on land.
All right. Yeah, I think you're onto something there.
So aren't we talking about the question of where it fits in with other kind of law?
Yeah.
So isn't it right in 1952? So you have moral law, and there's three types of moral law, which is eternal law, natural law. Four: eternal law, natural law, revealed law, and finally civil law, civil and ecclesial law. So, and natural law comes. That's where it fits into the types of law, I guess. Mm-hmm. Right?
Yeah. So what's the difference then between eternal law and natural law?
Natural law is the law that that comes from our heart. It's I'm trying to think of the quote. it's how we ought to, how we ought to act?
I would say natural law is an eternal law. It's the law. It's the law built into the nature of man by God. It's different from revealed law, although sometimes revelation contains the natural law also. But it's inherent in man as man, and which can be known by him by reason.
So let's take a look at a few things here. One, in paragraph 1951, law is declared and established by reason as a participation in the providence of the living God. So it's a participation in eternal law. That's another thing. Let's look at in 1955. This law is called natural, not in reference to the nature of irrational beings, but because reason, which decrees it properly, belongs to human nature. So it is something that is part of our, something that's part of our reason, that is natural, that's naturally there. Just as we naturally seek the truth, natural law is what dictates that the good is what is to be sought. What about, let's take a look at the, if we're jumping over to the excerpts from the Summa, what's the difference between first and second principles of natural law? Oh, Jerry, you're muted.
Well, he says that on page 2, he says that the second principles of natural law can be added to or subtracted to as mankind through the ages develops. But the first principle is always the first principles, which is man's pursuit of higher reason, which is God, which is innate to his soul to seek him.
Yeah, so how could we distinguish here between, a little more precisely, between primary and secondary principles of natural law?
Well, the primary natural law, the first principle is unchangeable. It's immutable because ultimately it is God. But then he says in the secondary principles, it can be added to or subtracted to. My printer smeared it, so I can't read it very well. He says, first, by way of addition, the natural law, secondarily, he says, a change in natural law can be understood in two ways. First, by addition. In this sense, nothing hinders the natural law from being changed, since many things for the benefit of human life have been added over and above the first principle natural law, both by the divine law and human law. So I regret that he didn't give any examples, but just throughout time, certain discoveries, I assume, were added to help us fully understand the first principle, which is God, over time. And then I guess it says, secondly, a change in the natural law can be understood by way of subtraction. And the first thing I thought about was slavery, how some people thought that it was good economically for civilization, but then we figured out it wasn't good because it was harmful to the dignity of man.
Well, let's make a distinction here. How are we going to distinguish between natural law and human law?
Well, like your dad said in the beginning, there's a hierarchy. There's a step-by-step hierarchy, and it starts with eternal law, which is God, and then the natural law, which is written in our reason and our soul, and then there's the civil law and the ecclesial law. So
How
there's,
can, well, how about this? For when we take the slavery example,
yeah,
um, was slavery a part of natural law?
no, it was civil law. It was part of civil law, but in man's understanding, in his darkened mind, well, I didn't live back then, so, but it seems that he thought it was a good thing. He thought it was,
Now, does that make it natural law, or does that make it a mistake?
it's not natural law. It's a civil law. It's a man-made mistake. So what you're asking, and that's a terrible example, I guess. Can you tell us what an example is that Thomas Aquinas is saying regarding addition and subtraction?
Well, how about this? Is when he's talking about addition and subtraction, are we to think of natural law as an unfolding of something over time, coming to a better understanding of something, like development of doctrine in the church? Or are we to think of it as adaptation, adapting basic principles to
Well,
circumstances and places?
I don't know the answer, but that's the first thing I thought was John Henry Newman and the development of doctrine. That was the first thing I thought of about second principles. The first principles immutable and unchanging. The second principles become perfected because we are imperfect right now, but we're learning.
Well, if we're, how about any other ideas here?
Well, I'm still confused because so far I've heard a bunch of adjectives, but I don't know where these adjectives, land. You said God's law is eternal. Okay, great. Where does that leave me? And then you're saying natural law is an extension of the eternal law. Okay, equally great, but I don't have any anchor yet to just, what is natural law supposed to be promoting? What is it? What is the goal of natural law?
What's the goal of natural law?
Let me put that in concrete using Thomas's example. Thomas says you can't commit adultery. And then he says, unless God tells you to.
If God commands it, is it adultery?
What's the other word for it?
Well, here's what Thomas says in his reply to the objection.
That's what I'm reading.
He says, adultery is intercourse with another's wife who is allotted to him by the law emanating from God.
Yeah.
So God determines whether it's adultery or not. It's not just, it's.
Well, wait a minute. God determines. Okay. It says, by the command of God. The person is a person. He says, God commanded me to have an intercourse with someone who is not my wife. Therefore, it's not adultery nor fornication. I mean, that is the history of the Protestant Reformation.
Yeah, that would sound more like nominalism.
That's exactly what they did. They said, I got a word from God. I'm to marry 6 women.
Well,
I've got a word from God. You're to sleep with me.
It's one thing to claim a command from God. It's another thing to have a command from God.
Great. Tell me how to make the distinction.
Yeah.
You cannot make a perfect distinction with another person.
Well,
you can't.
How does a person determine that what is happening to me is a command that I shall sleep with someone else's wife?
Well, that would be that would certainly come down to some sort of process of discernment. And if God was going to make that actually a command for you, then I'm pretty sure he would make it clear.
Well, there are a lot of breakaway sects in the church, and even preceding Luther, who that was the exact claim they made. That's the exact claim they made.
But the other aspect of it is also um, ecclesiastical law and divine revelation and the magisterium of the church. So that is another source for us of
Another source saying what?
that is revelatory of the eternal law.
Yeah,
So
but
natural
Sure,
law.
unless God commanded you. And they don't say anything on that.
What do you mean?
well,
We can look at the church law. You're not supposed to commit adultery. You're not supposed to fornicate. You turn around and say, I have a personal message from God. He has commanded me to do that. I will be disobeying God.
And then the church would have the right to judge that. And if the church judged to the contrary, that would be the judgment.
but still, I mean, even the church ecclesiastical law has to be based on something. And I thought that something was going to be natural law. And
Well,
so
if it's
what
purely
is
based on natural law, then why do we need the church?
I mean, natural law, this is where I'm trying to get to the definition of it. What is it trying to tell us? What is it saying? If it's saying, like I thought before, doing those things which makes a human being thrive as a human being,
Mhm.
then civil law and all those other laws will follow as derivatives of, like we need traffic lights so that people can maximize the flow and not kill anybody. It's because we want human beings to thrive. Okay, we're all following back to the natural law, but so far we don't have a definition of what natural law is.
Let's go back to our presentation. So here's the definition of law generally.
Okay.
That is given in the Summa. An ordination of reason for the common good, promulgated by the one who is in charge of the community. Okay, so law is an ordinance of reason, and it must be promulgated. Now, how does that play out? Now, eternal law is a different kind of law. Eternal law is the perfect plan of God's wisdom, which orders all that happens in the universe. Natural law is our share in the eternal law that's embedded in God, by God, in human reason. It's eternal law operating within us.
So then natural law is sort of evolving in the sense that as we learn more about ourselves and what is good for us. So for instance, my wife tells me I shouldn't drink Diet Coke because it's not good for me. But I've done research and it says, well, it's not as bad as what people think. So this is a discussion then on the natural law as to whether a human should drink Diet Coke or not?
In a certain sense, yes, it can be. I mean, you can use the principles of natural law to come to a judgment about that. But this is where the distinction between more primary precepts and secondary precepts comes in. So Thomas will say that the primary precepts are what cannot be changed. They're analogous to the first principles of the intellect, things like a thing cannot be and not be in the same respect at the same time, right? That's just something that's a baseline for any reasoning at all. Or the law of identity, a thing is itself. For Thomas, the baseline principle of natural law is do good, avoid evil. Good is to be done, evil is to be avoided. That is the baseline principle. Then everything else derives from that. And we have more primary precepts also in seeking our self-preservation. This can relate to the question about Diet Coke. Seeking society. How about marriage? Would we consider that to be a more primary precept or a more secondary precept?
Doug, you asked about marriage.
Hmm.
The only way I can come up with what Thomas is saying is to invoke Christ's words where he told them that Moses let you divorce because you were weak, but from the beginning, man and woman were not to be separated.
So that's
There's no, well, wait a minute, and that Thomas, the examples he's dealing with are all the Old Testament examples. The only way I can follow what he's saying and make sense of it is, before the full revelation of Christ, God allowed these things, commanded these things, even though they're against the natural law. I guess I'm misunderstanding this. The only way I can reconcile it.
So John, isn't everybody doesn't, we all have a right to do good, avoid evil, to seek self-preservation, to seek society, but not marriage. I mean, a priest doesn't have a right to be married. So I would think it's a secondary principle, a precept.
Well, I thought you were talking about the idea of marriage as the union of two people, the exclusive union as two people, and you were talking about fornication and other things, adultery. Then you could rely on the natural law to say, well, that harms society if we go around
Oh, I see what you're saying.
fornication, that would harm, that would be a harm to society. Therefore, it's a violation of natural law.
Yeah, I think that I mean I suppose maybe this is arguable, but I would argue that the institution of marriage is part of the more primary precepts of natural law. I think another of those primary precepts that would flow from that, Dad, that you were getting at is also that not everybody has a right to marry. That because of and this goes back into self-preservation also, not in terms of personal, but in terms of the society and the human race. In order to form a family, there are certain natural responsibilities that come along with that, right? So all of those considerations, obviously, there are some things about natural law that seem to be very clearly primary, and some things that are secondary. I think, Jerry, what you were getting at is also very important, in that as Christians, we can look at what Christ said about marriage, and we can say this is evidence that marriage is part of the natural law because it was part of what we were from the beginning. It's not so it's not as clear to get to that purely from the point of reason, but there are certainly strong arguments to be made for it.
Getting back to an earlier point, somebody had
I follow that one, Marty.
say what?
I follow that one. If you can't get there by reason, then it's not part of the natural law.
Well, I'm not saying you can't get there by reason. I'm just saying that it's a much shorter way to get there using divine revelation.
Oh, sure. And that's why you get the Ten Commandments.
But following on that line of thought, if somebody says, I just have a divine revelation where God tells me it is okay for me to commit adultery, we could challenge that revelation because we would say, wait a minute, that violates the natural law. That harms society, that harms self-preservation, that harms families. So therefore, I contest your revelation. And I don't think it really is from God.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah.
Okay. So natural law is a means by which we can judge personal revelations.
Judge and contest are two different things.
I hesitate to make any statement about revelations. That's, to be honest, we're getting outside of my scope here into mystical areas. But we could say, and based on the arguments also Thomas makes that we were just looking at, aside from the question of the ability to judge whether I have actually received such a revelation, that if God made such a commandment as he did to people in the Old Testament to do things that seem to us clearly contrary to natural law, that would not be, in fact, contrary to natural law or to eternal law. And that's the reason that the secondary principles, the further you get away from this, if you are purely going on natural law, then the secondary principles can fail to be accurate in certain cases. And so they serve as a general precept, but they are not, the secondary principles, because of their derivative status, are not perfect articulations of the divine law in every case.
John, can I just say something quickly?
Yes.
The four examples that are given about human sacrifice, the Egyptians stealing the gold, the reading from Hosea and First Kings, you had already taught us before that you have to look at the Old Testament in context, that the Old Testament can be read on 4 levels: literary, allegorical, typological, and anagogical. The Hosea one here is an allegory. Hosea wasn't a real person. It was, the book of Hosea was written, it was, Gomer was the wife of fornications. It was really, Gomer was an allegory for the nation of Israel, which had played harlot to all the pagan kingdoms. As far as the Genesis story, when he ordered the Jews to borrow or purloin the vessels of the Egyptians, it's because they had been enslaved for hundreds of years, and they were justifiably not only taking them. If you read the Old Testament, the Jews went, not the Jews, the pagan Egyptians, some of them went with the Jews, the Israelites, and brought the gold. The book says they borrowed it and they purloined it, but they didn't. God wasn't saying take it. And when Abraham went to slay his son, that also was a teaching vessel that Moses had written down as an example that God did not allow him to kill his son. He was just teaching them. He was teaching Abraham and the Israelites that all the nations had human sacrifice except the Abrahamic tribes. He was teaching them something new. Anyway, the point I'm making is God did not violate natural law or his eternal law by these Bible stories. The Bible stories have to be looked at in context of who the audience was and the time period. And the thing about this study that drove me crazy is because I couldn't remember how you taught us last week that when you read the Summa, you have to go to the objection first. I'm sorry, the reply to the objection first. So I was all mixed up because I think some of our students in tonight's class didn't realize that even the Summa homework you gave us was taken out of context. Do you understand what I'm saying?
Well, okay, a few things here. First, I'm not going to get too much into biblical exegesis here as far as the Old Testament goes. But even if we take these examples off the table, there are many times where God commanded the slaughter of what, for all intents and purposes, seem to be innocent people.
Okay, I see. Yeah.
Okay, number
Yeah.
one. Number two, in terms of reading the Summa, the don't go to the reply to the objection first. Go to the on the contrary and the response. The on the contrary and the I answer. So read those sections first,
Okay.
and then go back to the objection and the reply to the objection. Because the objection and the reply do need to go together.
Okay, thank you.
Let's take a look here at conscience. So conscience is an act. It's an intellectual act that is knowledge, judging rightness or wrongness of my performing of an action here and now. Okay, so it's a judgment. It's a judgment of the intellect about the rightness or wrongness of an act here and now. Some clarifications: conscience is not a passion or an act of the will. It's not a power or a part of the soul or a desire.
Question. If you say it is not part of the soul, then where is it coming from?
It is an act of the soul. So we can distinguish between powers and parts and their acts. So a power of the soul would be the intellect or the will. Okay. So
Okay,
these are powers, each with their
conscience
proper
is an
act.
intellectual, and conscience is an intellectual act, as the intellect is trying to figure out what is the good or what is
As the intellect judges the rightness or wrongness of the particular act, and it makes the judgment. So it's conscience is the act. It's that judgment of rightness or wrongness after deliberation. So according to St. Thomas, conscience always binds, but does not always excuse. And the point of this is that we are required to follow the judgment of our conscience that says what is right or wrong. But that we are not always excused from the consequence of that, because we may be responsible for the wrongness that went into a wrong act. If we go back to, let's see.
There you go.
If we go back to here, all right, so remember the primacy of the intellect in knowing the true, all the way up here, okay? So once we get to a judgment about the rightness or wrongness of both, we're really talking about the choice down here, judgment of the choice to be made. We can err in all of these, but St. Thomas says, because this is our recourse, this is what tells us this choice is the right or the wrong choice. Conscience must be followed, but let's go back to, let's see if I have it in here. Actually, I think the best place to go from that, because I know that's going to open up some questions about conscience. Let's defer any questions on conscience until we get to Pope John Paul II and that discussion of his from his encyclicals. But before we do that, let's briefly go through some contemporary ethical theories. I'm just going to go through these rather quickly. So deontology is a duty-based system. The most famous formulation comes from Immanuel Kant, where he distinguishes hypothetical and categorical imperatives. Hypothetical imperatives are non-universalizable. They refer to particular ends that just pertain to a more limited category of action. Just for instance, a hypothetical imperative would be the dictative reason that tells you how to get from your living room to the grocery store. Categorical imperative, his formulation is act only according to that maxim whereby you can at the same time will that it should become a universal law. This is his famous categorical imperative. And so he thinks that this will come up with infallible, basically, statements of ethics. Deontology is really opposed to consequentialism, so it ignores the consequences. So the right thing, deontology, the duty is to be done regardless of what the consequences of that are going to be. And a notable difference between the virtue ethics that we've been talking about is that the greatest acts for Kant involves a great deal of striving and strenuous deliberation, not habit and pleasure, as Aristotle determines virtue to be. Another approach, pragmatism. What's right is what works well in practice. Some famous purveyors of this are John Dewey and William James. So their foundation for this is to believe that ethics is basically like empirical science, and ethical principles are subject to revision in the same way that the laws of that scientific laws are, that they're revised over time. The primary location of morality resides not in individuals, not in individual acts, but really in the society. So it's very much a relativist system. Not too far from that is utilitarianism or consequentialism. Here, what's right is what is useful for achieving some positive effect. Examples of this, Marxism, Peter Singer. If you're familiar with the pop philosopher Sam Harris, you could probably think of a lot of politicians. And it's usually framed in terms of what is going to bring about the most happiness or welfare or well-being, either for individuals or for the society as a whole. Two divisions usually made in this: rule utilitarianism and act utilitarianism. So rule utilitarianism says that in order to get, for example, the most happiness for the most number of people, everybody must follow this rule. And then act utilitarianism says that the particular acts are derived from the end in mind. So it doesn't dictate principles, but it's more individual. The same act, the same category of act might be good under act utilitarianism right now that is wrong for act utilitarianism 10 minutes from now. I mentioned postmodernism here, not because we can really give it, say that it has a particular kind of ethical system, because the philosophers that are postmodernists really run the gambit. But it's somewhat prevalent now. So some principles of postmodernism that are certainly related to ethics. By and large, there's a rejection of the universal validity of reason and logic. So making these essentially social constructs that are relative to a particular culture. Obviously, if reason itself is not universally valid, then neither is natural law, which resides in reason. Okay, again, values are embedded in a particular culture, and the concepts it should say concepts are not shareable or transferable, not that they are, but that there's basically, even when the same culture talks about the same kind of precept or the same kind of action, that it doesn't necessarily refer to the same thing. Often postmodernists will discuss the self as a social construct or as an abstraction. Really what matters is the whole, is the society, to the extent that the self is not even a thing, not even any kind of substance. Well, the idea of substance itself is denied by postmodernism. So let's take a look now at our last readings. John Paul II's critique of ethics in modernity. And let's take a look at conscience, and these quotes from Veritatis Splendor, and what the authentic role of conscience is in the moral act. Or maybe what is his critique? What does he say is the wrong approach that that modern philosophies are pushing?
When I read that first question, I thought about there's a very famous New York Times quote of John Paul II, very early in his pontificate, and they quoted John Paul as saying, "Follow your conscience." But if you go back and look at the actual text of what he said, "Follow your conscience, comma, after it was properly formed." Mm-hmm. So what I believe he's saying here in Veritatis Splendor is that the individual conscience is according to the status of the supreme tribunal of moral judgment, which hands down the categorical and infallible decisions about good and evil. So you need to know what those are as you're forming your, before you can act on your conscience. You need to know what the categorical and infallible decisions about good and evil are. What is good and what is the ultimate good? So, back to everything that you've said this whole class, our ultimate goal is happiness, happiness being with God, and then everything else transcends from that. So forming conscience has to do with knowing what is the eternal law, in order to help us to do that. Another friend of yours and mine, a former federal judge, you know who he is, told me once that he said, "You Catholics are really lucky because," and this is during the time he was talking about John Paul and Benedict. He says, "You got the Pope to help you form your conscience." Mm-hmm. And I mean, he was not talking about the person of the Pope, but he was talking about the body of truth that's found in the Catholic Church that helps us in order to do that.
Right. So how about, he says, let's take a look at this. He says, this is going right on what you were saying, Dad. On the right-hand side of the page, in the first full paragraph, he says, the function of the conscience is to apply the universal knowledge of the good in a specific situation, and thus to express a judgment about the right conduct to be chosen here and now. So again, we have to have this more general, more universal knowledge of the good. And this goes back to the proper formation of the conscience. Now, what about what's the error, or what's the main error that he's pointing out here? Actually, you were touching on it when you were mentioning his quote being taken out of context from the New York Times. He says here, the affirmation that one's moral judgment is true merely by the fact that it has its origin in conscience. So from that, it seems like, oh, we could just say, I'm following my conscience and this is right. And what he's saying is no, because the function of the conscience is applying a universal knowledge of the good to a specific situation.
Yeah.
How about scientism or pragmatism? What's the problem with these philosophies in terms of ethics?
They consider metaphysics meaningless.
Yeah.
And I'm going into my next class. So you have to, everything has to be proven, scientifically proven to be true. And if it can't be proven, it's not true, or you can't make a judgment on it. Where metaphysics allows you to take that extra step.
Right. We have to have metaphysics in order even to explain the principles that modern science is based on.
That there is a God.
So the problem with science, a couple other things he's mentioning here. Like you're saying, it consigns all that has to do with the question of the meaning of life to the realm of the irrational or imaginary. So some of the most severe statements of this were in the early 20th century logical positivists, literally referring to statements on metaphysics, ethics, and religion, not just as wrong or misguided, but as literally meaningless.
Mm-hmm.
So then the sense with scientism is that we can dominate all aspects of human life, he says, through technological progress. And also the idea that if something is technically possible, it is therefore morally admissible. So then we lose any sense, any ground outside of science to judge whether science itself can proceed in certain areas.
Human cloning.
Yeah, you can think of cloning.
Making a vaccine with aborted fetal tissue.
Okay.
What he's saying is that the scientists and the positivists are very limited, he said, and conditional in their ways to know the truth. So they refuse to look at the ancient philosophers. They refuse to look at theology.
Right.
They dismiss anything that has to do with morals or values as products of emotion.
Yeah, we're going to have to in a future class, either in 8 or 9, we're going to have to look at some of Pope Benedict's Regensburg address on faith and reason, and he really takes some of these arguments head on as well.
Well, didn't even Kurt Gödel shot down the whole roots of positivism? Gödel was a mathematician, and I think even Turing came in and also both of them showed that it wasn't logically possible. The roots of scientific positivism were groundless.
Yeah, I'm actually not too familiar with what they say about that. If you had any, if you have anything,
I'm also reaching from the far ends of my knowledge. Kurt Gödel was a mathematician, and oh gosh, now I can't remember. He came up with 2 famous mathematical theses, which showed that positivism and the scientific approach could not be used as the ultimate guide for everything. And he did it from a philosophical, mathematical
Yeah.
approach. And Turing, independently of Gödel, also came to the same conclusion. And that's why positivism kind of died out in the 20s.
Thank you. I'm going to see if I can look that up, and then I'll put a note about it on the blog.
It's two famous theses, but I can't remember them right now.
How about going on to Evangelium Vitae, the dangers of idolizing democracy? Democracy and individualism. The theme of the conscience comes back in here.
Well, we're back to the common good based on moral law, and the democracy has to do with one of the isms that you just talked about. And I have the wrong piece of paper. Where you vote on it, and it has, however you vote, it has to be good. And that's the whole thing about law. The whole idea of law was based upon eternal law and the natural law. So I just remember I took a course from Father Saunders years, and as a matter of fact, I was trying to find the notes where he laid out everything. And so the civil law is based upon, and civil law is part of a democracy where you're voting for things. Mm-hmm. True law is based on the common good, which is based on natural law and eternal law. So right. All those have to be in sync. So, the Catholic Church, and he says, I don't know whether he says it in here, but there's another place in Evangelium Vitae where he talks about not obeying immoral laws. Well, what are immoral laws? Immoral laws are laws that are created possibly through a democracy, obviously through a democracy, because it was elected, it was voted on, but do not follow either the natural law or the eternal law.
Yeah, so let's follow the thread of his thought here in this last passage. So he refers to, at the bottom of the second to last page, he refers to a ethical position by the utilitarian John Stuart Mill. That's that the sole limitation is not infringing on the freedom and rights of any other citizen. If you ever heard that formulation, that my freedom ends where yours begins, or something like that, right? What happens here, what he's talking about is that we would require the legislative level observe the autonomy of the individual conscience as the prime thing. And in that case, the only determining factor in morality is the will of the majority. And right. Then in that case, the politician, this is where we have politicians who will say, I'm personally pro-abortion, but the public will says this is what I should do. So
like pro-life.
Right. Yeah. I'm personally pro-life, but I'm going to vote against. I'm going to vote pro-abortion because of that, because of the public will, not because of not because of natural law, or a good that goes deeper than just the personal judgment of the majority of the individuals. And then what happens is the democracy in such a case votes for itself the maximum possible freedoms for the individual. And this is where we get to the John Stuart Mill's formulation. And then And then what he's reminding us at the very end of this is democracy is a system, and as such is a means to an end. That democracy itself is not a panacea. He says the value of democracy stands or falls with the values which it embodies or promotes. And those values must include the dignity of every human person, respect for inviolable and inalienable human rights, adoption of the common good as the end and criterion regulating political life. And then the very key points, very strong points, strong words at the end here. I think it's a warning. The basis of these values must be the acknowledgement of an objective moral law, which, as the natural law written in the human heart, is the obligatory point of reference for civil law itself. And then at the end, if as a result of obscuring of the collective conscience, that's not respected, then the democratic system itself would be reduced to a mere mechanism for regulating different and opposing interests on a purely empirical basis. And then it's at that point, the democracy has ceased to become a means for the common good. And it just becomes a tool for regulating different interest groups that have varying degrees of power. So, well, we're at 8:58 now. This is definitely our most packed session so far, but we had a lot to cover. Any parting questions or words? Here?
Oh, I just looked it up. It's Kurt Gödel, and he has 2 incompleteness theorems. The theorems are called the incompleteness theorems, and from that he shoots down positivism. And you might do well to look at some YouTube videos, because when I tried to go through those, it was way over my head. But so find a layman that can kind of, bring it down to us. Yeah.
Great. Yeah, I'll see if I can look something up for that.
Yeah.
Thank you. Thanks, Marty. Good to have you join us.
Oh, thank you. Also, I just sent you an email. How can I get the previous lessons?
Oh, they're all, did you get well, obviously you got my email earlier with the Zoom.
Right.
If you go to that link, the link that's in there's a link to a blog site that's in that email, and it's all there.
Okay, great. Thank you.
I was horribly distracted with the Evangelium Vitae on democracy, because your mother came back from the Beijing Women's Conference in 1995 with a poster, and you've probably seen it around the house, and it said, "The family, the smallest democracy in the world." And her argument was, well, you never want to have more than 2 kids then.
That's right.
You'll get outvoted at the kitchen table.
Okay, next week I'm on vacation. I'll be camping, and I'm not going to lead a session from the campground. So we're going to take a week off, as the schedule indicates, and then we're going to come back and we're going to look at natural theology. So natural theology is basically anything we can say about God from the standpoint of philosophy and reason, apart from revealed religion. Okay, we're going to recap some of the arguments for the existence of God, both from Aristotle and Aquinas, and then my dad is also going to give a presentation in the context of that, on the perspective of modern science, which will also be very fascinating and enlightening. So I will send out information on that Friday or Saturday, sometime before I leave, but you'll have plenty of time to look at the materials for that, and then we will regroup again in 2 weeks. All right. Thank you very much, everybody.
Thank you much.
Thank you.